Hello math people, it's Dr. Simmons here and I'm back with part 2 of solving equations. So in part 2, I want to focus on quadratic equations. In part 1, I just focused on linear equations, just solving linear equations. I gave you 5 steps that I would suggest you take in solving linear equations. In this video, we're going to focus on quadratic equations. So my suggestion to you, whenever you watch my videos, it's only a suggestion, y'all. It's just a suggestion. You don't have to do it, but this is just what I find to be the best route for students that I have taught in the past. So quadratic equations. Step 1, when you are trying to solve a quadratic equation, step 1, make sure it's in standard form. Make sure your equation is in standard form. And what I mean by that is you need a 0 on one side and you need all of your terms on the other side, and the variable, the exponent on the variable should be set up in descending order. So like your highest exponent should be first. And then if you have a constant term, it should be last. It should be set up in descending order. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Step 2, try to factor completely. If you are great at factoring, you should be good at solving a quadratic equation. So step 2, once you get it in standard form, try to factor completely. Once you have it factored completely, step 3 is to set each one of your factors equal to 0, and then you solve for the variable. And you should have your answer. Okay, step 1, set it up in standard form. Step 2, factor completely. And step 3, set each one of your factors equal to 0, and then you should have your answer. Now, you may not be able to factor the equation. You may not be able to factor it. So I had to put a step 4 and 5 in here. So step 4, if you cannot solve or factor the equation, step 4 is to use the square root method. You could possibly use the square root method to solve the quadratic equation. So I want to show you how to do the square root method. And last but not least, step number 5. I call step number 5 like the lifesaver, because you literally can go from step 1 to step 5 if you don't know how to do any of the stuff in between. I call it a lifesaver for students because it is the quadratic formula. Like literally, you can solve any quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. It's a little bit more tedious and it seems like it takes longer to do, but you are guaranteed to always get the right answer, even if you don't know how to factor. So step 5 will be using the quadratic formula. Any quadratic equation can be solved using the quadratic formula. So let's go through all the steps one by one. Let's go. Okay, so welcome to part 2 of solving equations, and this time we're going to focus on quadratic equation. So we're going to start out with an example, and I'm going to run through the steps again. So you'll see how each one of the steps corresponds to an example. So the first step I said was to put the equation in standard form. This is important. It has to be in standard form so you can get an idea of what technique you should use. So standard form is basically ax squared plus bx plus c. And I don't like these uppercase letters. I'm going to change this to lowercase. It's just a math thing. I'm sure you could keep the capital letters there, but I'm used to seeing it with lowercase, so I'm just going to change it to lowercase. Don't mind me. So ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This is the standard form. So basically you want 0 on one side, and then you want your terms set up in descending order by the power. And also no fractions. It will be better if you do not have fractions in your standard form for a quadratic equation. So the equation that we're going to use, I'm going to start out with an equation that's written in standard form. That's x squared minus x minus 12 equals 0. So you notice this one is set up in standard form because you have 0 on one side and then you have descending order with your exponents on the left-hand side. So the second thing you want to do is try to factor completely. You're not always going to be able to factor, but if you can, go ahead and do that. If you need to know about factoring, I have that in another video. I'll put that in the description. So with this particular problem, there's no GCF, there's 3 terms, so I do 2 sets of parentheses with an X in each one. Now we need to figure out, what do I multiply to get negative 12, but when I add, I get negative 1. That will be negative 4 and positive 3. If you multiply those, you get negative 12. If you add those, you get negative 1. So those are the numbers that go inside the parentheses. Now, step 3 is to set each one of your factors equal to 0. Now, I have 2 of them here. 2 sets of parentheses. I'm going to set both of them equal to 0, and then I solve. Once you set it equal to 0 and you solve, you're going to have the solution for the equation. So I'm going to take x minus 4 and set it equal to 0, and then I'm going to take x plus 3 and set it equal to 0. So that's going to give you x is equal to 4 and x is equal to negative 3 when you go through and solve. So that's how you handle that equation. So let me put another one up here. So I have 3 steps, right? Your first step, put it in standard form. Second step, factor completely. Your third step, set it equal to 0. Set each factor equal to 0. So let's look at another equation. 2x squared minus x minus 3 is equal to 0. So let's say you don't want to factor. It's already set up in standard form, right? And let's say you don't want to factor this problem. You could use another technique, and that's where step 4 and 5 come into play. Now, step 4 says you could use the square root property, but you can only use the square root property if you have one variable term, okay? It's not going to work if you have 2 variable terms like this problem is set up right here. I have 2x squared minus x. I can't really do square root property the way that it's set up right now. You could manipulate it a little bit and do the square root property, but it creates a little bit more of a challenge. My suggestion is that you go right to quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is the negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now let me tell you, this equation looks long, but it is a guarantee. Students say even though it takes a little bit longer to work it this way, it is a guarantee to get the right answer. So if I let my a be equal to 2, my b be equal to negative 1, and my c be equal to negative 3, so a equals 2, b equals negative 1, and c equals negative 3, I can take those values and put them into the quadratic formula, condense everything, and I will get my final answer. So let's do that. I have negative b, so that's negative 1. And then I put plus or minus the square root of b squared. So that's negative 1 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, and c, which is negative 3, all over 2 times a, which is 2. So now I need to condense this. Negative 1 times the negative is going to give you a positive 1. And then underneath the radical, you got negative 1 squared, which is 1. And then you have plus 24, because you do negative 4 times 2 times negative 3. And then your denominator, you have a 4. Now I'm going to add the 1 and the 24. I get square root of 25. And we know the square root of 25 is 5. So 1 plus or minus 5 over 4. That creates 2 answers. 1 plus 5 over 4 and 1 minus 5 over 4. Let's see what that gives us. 6 over 4. And that reduces into 3 over 2. And then the other answer is going to be negative 4. Let me zoom in. The other answer will be negative 4 over 4, which reduces into negative 1. So I have 2 answers here. I have x is equal to 3 over 2, and x is equal to negative 1. Those are our two answers. If you would have factored this, you would have gotten the same two answers. So it's two different ways to do the same thing or get the same answer. So let me erase this. Let's put another example up. Erase, 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 erase. So I'm going to put an equation that's not written in standard form. Okay, so this one is not written in standard form, right? So let's try to put it in standard form. First, let me get rid of the parentheses. So I distribute. That's going to create 6w squared plus w is equal to 2. Still not in standard form. I got to move the 2 over. So move the 2 over. You get 6w squared plus w minus 2 is equal to 0. That's set up in standard form. Now, I don't want to factor this. I could, but I don't want to. So I'm going to use the quadratic. I can't use the square root property because I have two terms here with variables. And it'll make it a little bit more complicated if I try to do square root property. Not impossible, but it's a little more complicated. So I have A is equal to 6, B is equal to 1, and C is equal to negative 2. Let's plug everything in and see what we get. So negative 1 plus or minus 1 squared minus 4 times 6 times negative 2. Now, when I condense all the stuff underneath, and at the bottom I got 2 times 6. Sorry about that. So negative 1 plus or minus, I got 1 plus 4 times 6 times negative 2. That's going to be 1 plus 48 over 2 times 6, which is 12. And let me go ahead and add 48 and 1. That's going to give you square root of 49. I'm condensing everything underneath the radical. And I know the square root of 49. The square root of 49 is 7. So I put negative 1 plus or minus 7 over 12. That creates two different answers. So let's write both of the answers down, right? It's going to be negative 1 plus 7 over 12. And then negative 1 minus 7 over 12. So let's zoom in and see what two answers we get for that. That's going to be 6 over 12, which reduces into 1/2. And then I got negative 8 over 12. When I reduce that, I can divide the top and the bottom by 4. So that's going to give me 2 over 3. So negative 2 over 3. So the two answers I got for this problem is W is equal to 1/2 and also negative 2 over 3. Those are the two answers. If you would have factored this, you would have gotten the same two answers. So again, I'm just showing you different options that you can use, okay? Now, I want to do one more example dealing with the square root property because we haven't seen that yet, and I want to show you how that works. So erase, erase, erase. So I'm going to give you another example. X squared minus 18 is equal to 0. So this is a situation where it would be good to use the square root property. So to do the square root property, you need to first get the variable term isolated. So the x squared needs to be on one side by itself. So what I'm going to do is move the 18 to the other side. Then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. But when I take the square root, I have to put plus or minus in front of the square root. So square root of x squared is x. And then plus or minus square root of 18. So here, when you take the square root of 18, you can't really do that and get a whole number. So what I do to simplify that is I break the 18 up into 9 times 2 and take the square root of the 9. The square root of 9 is 3 and it comes out of the radical. So you get your answer. X is equal to plus or minus 3 square root 2. Okay, math people, you have made it through another video with Dr. Simmons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye.